Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, is the United States ready to throw in the towel regarding Ukraine? That is something we're going to look into. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of this discussion, and there are some really fascinating comments that are coming out that potentially put this as a reality.
Yeah, well, thanks for joining again today, Ken. Always a pleasure. And yes, I think we take a little bit of a back step first, and I think it's worth reiterating the point. It's not something that pleases Trump supporters, I know, but the Trump administration was arming the Ukrainians in 2019, and the question that people should be asking is why. I mean, I'm not saying Trump was arming them to go to war. Absolutely not. But you don't arm a nation unless you anticipate either they need to defend themselves or maybe they are going to war. And the question, therefore, is was it in somewhere in the Trump administration's mind that events could get worse in Ukraine? Whether that was at the US's intervention or not, we'll never know. But that is something we shouldn't forget because that certainly was a contributory factor to why the Ukraine war is started and why it's carrying on. But what we're making reference to is the fact that Trump made a big point when he was in his election campaign. I'll end the war in 24 hours. Well, that's never happened and it never was going to happen. And the US administration is getting frustrated because it's very typical of the Americans that when they want something to happen, it has to happen yesterday. And we don't really want to think about the consequences of a decision. We win politically by going end the war today. And then we've achieved our objective. Whether Ukraine implodes 2 weeks later is not our problem. He always wanted to come in and go, well, we've had a ceasefire. See, we stopped the war, and then the Russians and the Ukrainians can take over. And they didn't care then what the consequences of that would be. Well, subsequently, of course, that's not transpired either. There was these veiled threats that if Russia doesn't start to toe the line, and because we don't think they're taking this seriously, then we're going to take stern action against them. And Russia doesn't care because it's survived this long. I know something like 25,000 sanctions on them. I mean, what's another 10,000 nothing or 2,000, whatever it might be? It's pointless. And the US has kind of now realized this. But that puts them in a bit of a dilemma because they can stand there at trying to act tough, but it means nothing. And then Rubio came out and made a very telling statement where it kind of implies the US is going to walk away from the Ukraine war. And people think, oh, that means they're going to let the Europeans come in and start World War III. Absolutely not. That is utter nonsense. That is not ever going to happen because Europe is going to do absolutely nothing unless the United States is party to it and basically stands there as the Rottweiler while the little Chihuahuas are yapping behind the Rottweiler. And the United States is never going to start a war with Russia. So when Rubio says the United States will stop trying to broker a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine within days, unless there are clear signs that a deal can be reached now. Of course, he could be just thinking, well, if I make this statement, it might shake the Ukrainians and the Russians because they'll wonder, what does this mean next? Well, for Ukraine, that's particularly a big problem because they still feel they need to rely on the United States for everything, armaments, financing. Well, that's all gone by the wayside, not least because the United States really hasn't got anything to give Ukraine anymore. But Ukraine's also rather fearful if the US walks away, the Chihuahuas all go, well, we can't really deal with this. We don't want to deal with it. So then Ukraine just has to sue for peace, irrespective. But the other side to this is that making the statements Rubio has isn't going to change Russia's perspective whatsoever. They've made their position very clear. We are only going to entertain the idea of ending the war if you address our core issues. And I don't want to repeat things too much, but it's very obvious. Ukraine neutrality, Ukraine never joins the NATO in any way, shape, or form. That you recognize the territory we've already regarded as being part of the Russian Federation, including Crimea. And demilitarization means demilitarization. Effectively, Ukraine would be in no position in the future to go to war with anyone. And as things stand, we're a million miles away from achieving those objectives. And the US basically now regards the Ukraine war as a massive millstone around their neck because they can't end it on their terms. They can't end it in the sense of, well, we'll just call the shots. We'll decide how it's going to end. And when they've realized that's not going to happen, in true US style, they go, well, let's just walk away from this and then we'll just make sure it's someone else's problem, because they're deeply fearful that at some point, if the war doesn't end, they risk owning the war. And it stops being Biden's war, which to a large extent that's true, and it becomes Trump's war. And they can't have that. So the US will walk away and say, well, we tried. The Trump administration, but no one would agree, and they'll put all the blame on Ukraine and Russia, why the parties don't want the war to end, or they've got no incentive to do so. I mean, there is rumors Ukraine has said, we're prepared to have an unconditional ceasefire. It's down to the Russians. The Russians will never agree to a ceasefire because they know that won't lead to a peace agreement in any way, shape, or form that's lasting. So then the question is, well, if the war doesn't end and the war just carries on and the Americans walk away from it, what's the outcome? And I'll pass this over to you, Ken, because we'll park that for the next part of the discussion.
Yeah, I think there's two important parts I want to go ahead and speak upon here. The first one is that Russia, in my opinion, was very smart. They played along with President Trump in regards to the potential of a ceasefire, and we want a ceasefire. We want the end of the conflict, but at the same time, not giving into that and allowing Zelensky to reveal Kiev and his administration what they are. They, we just had the Ukrainian parliament vote to extend the martial law. Now, of course, the parliament really is a rubber stamp of Zelensky's government. So there we know whether it's the mineral deals, whether it's the breaking of the agreement not to hit energy infrastructure, everything that has gone on, Zelensky has broken in just the short amount of time since Trump has gotten involved in trying to create a ceasefire. So he recognizes that Russia's not going to give in to its demands, period, and realizing that Zelensky is not somebody who can be trusted in any promises. So then, of course, you have Europe, which continues in many ways not just to do the hyperbolic rhetoric, but recently we had Merz trying to save his political skin by saying that we're going to go ahead and give long-range missiles. And then who was it? Zakharova came out yesterday and said, yeah, if Germany allows that to happen and they hit anywhere in Russian territory, whether it's Crimea or such, then Germany is going to pay the price because they are now part of the conflict. And I think since Trump and the administration have so many spinning plates going on right now, whether it's Yemen, whether it's Iran, whether it's China, whether it's this trade war, whether it's Ukraine, at a certain point, you've got to ditch the one that is the less meaning to you, so you can focus on the other different aspects. And I think that's something else Rubio pointed on, is he said after 3 years and billions spent, the U.S. must refocus on other priorities.
sorry, the plan was always to switch focus. Ukraine was a millstone around their neck. But yeah, Germany giving the Taurus missiles, meaning that even the German military came out and said it won't make any scrap of difference. Yeah, Zaharova comes out and makes the statement, but they said it before and it's meaningless because they were firing, ATACMS into Russia. Russia shoots them down. And that's the end of that. It's just, again, really silly statements by the Russians. Well, they don't need to say this. It's absolutely pointless. They're not going to escalate a conflict on the basis of them firing Taurus missiles. They didn't with ATACMS, they didn't with Storm Shadow. So this is just trying to frighten the Germans a bit. But Germany's not going to do anything without the Americans. And basically, the Ukrainians came out and said to a large extent, we need the Americans for satellite guidance to fire missiles. So if the Americans don't partake, what do they do with Taurus missiles? Just fire them randomly. So the reality is that the United States walks away, says we want to wash our hands of this because it's a total embarrassment, because all our game changers failed, all our military expertise was proved to be useless. We've wasted huge sums of money and we don't want to waste any more money. So the war can just carry on and we'll just pretend we never were involved. And because they rely on the fact the American people, they hope, have a short enough attention span to have moved on to something else. I mean, just look at what's happened with all the tariff debacle. The Ukraine war's almost been partially forgotten by people. So it'd be very easy to switch the American people off the Ukraine war, pretend it was never a problem, come out with some nonsense about how we tried to end the war, and if there's nothing we can do because the warring parties will carry on. And then the US will try and just walk out the back door. Europe is going to do nothing, probably. It might make a lot of noise and make some ridiculous statements about what it intends doing. And, I mean, even Callis tried to get Europe to give Ukraine 40 billion. They refused. They went, they can have 5 billion and be grateful. I mean, everyone's just run out of money, run out of any enthusiasm to keep the war going. So the logical argument is if the US does carry through its threat and walks away, Europe will be just powerless because they won't want to make decisions without the Americans. So Ukraine's then left with nothing. And when it runs out of whatever it's got left, then the war will end, because then they'll have to just surrender. And then Russia will say, this is how the war's going to end. These are our terms, and you'll have to surrender unconditionally. And therefore, the war ends on the basis of when Russia says the war ends, and it will end when Ukraine runs out of everything, which it is likely to do so if the Americans walk away in totality. And then that's the end of the war. And then the United States will just slip off into the night like they always do, and realize in a few months the Americans will forget about the war because there'll be something else for them to think about. And that's how it will end. And for the Ukrainians, it's absolutely horrendous, because this is what always happens when the US realizes they've lost. They'll never admit they lost, but they'll just walk away and go, someone else's problem. Yeah, we started it, but we're going to pretend we didn't. And then Ukraine then will probably sign this deal with the Americans, who will then eventually, they think, get their money back, which they won't. And through this kind of mineral deal. And then the question is, what happens to Ukraine in the future? Because when the war's over, there's going to be enormous problems as to what is going to happen with what's left of Ukraine. I mean, Europe and everyone will abandon them. Then the problem is they're just an economic financial basket case. Politically, it's a complete mess internally. And then the question is, what will happen? And Ukraine will probably end up being virtually abandoned by everyone. And the people you have to feel sorry for are the Ukrainian people, because they're the ones who are going to suffer. They've already suffered enormously and shouldn't suffer anymore, but they will. And politically, who knows what will happen? The country could potentially descend into total chaos. And someone's going to have to go in and sort this mess out. And the irony of ironies is it might end up being Russia, who has to then deal with the aftermath of the complete abject failure of the West to realize it could never fight a war with Russia, because Russia's got more nuclear weapons than any other country in the world. It has the most advanced weapons, and it barely threw any major offensive in Ukraine. It fought with a very limited military presence. It had no intention of destroying the country or storming Kiev in 3 days or anything like that. And that's the legacy of what happens when nations decide to be backed by the Americans. If the Americans want you to do their dirty work, you run as fast as you can in the opposite direction, because the outcome is always disastrous. And this is another example, rather like Vietnam, where the United States spent years fighting it. And look at how they left. And look how quickly they wanted the Vietnam War forgotten, because it was an absolute embarrassment to the US that they ever went in the first place. Well, Ukraine's precisely the same. So they have to have a get-out clause now. We'll see if this is a bluff call. Maybe it is by Rubio, but you have to logically think it probably isn't. And this is the Americans going, well, if we can't end it this way, we'll just walk away and then it'll end all by itself. And really, the Ukrainian war effort will just fizzle out to nothing. Then there'll just basically be a mass surrender. And then Russia will say, this is how it ends. And that's how it will end. And history will be whitewashed to try and deny what really happened. But I hope there's enough people out there who will write about the truth of what happened. So in history, people genuinely start to realize that you can never trust the United States as an ally and never, ever do their dirty work.
Just to end our conversation here, there are three things that happened over the past couple days that really give significance on just potentially how unready the United States military is to be able to continue a number of conflicts. It appears that a new report came out that Washington is overcommitting itself in the Houthi campaign in Yemen, putting too many valuable resources that are hard to replace. We have the at least report that Trump told Tel Aviv that no, you can't. We're not going to go bombing the Iranian nuclear facilities, which could be potentially a good bargaining chip to try to get Iran to talk with them and come up with some type of commitment and agreement in regards to their nuclear facilities. And then we have the United States ready to pull completely out of Syria. So if the U.S. is suddenly pulling out of these places that they've been for the past who knows how many years or even recent conflicts, this is screaming significance, not just that they want to focus solely on China, but that they really don't have the capacity to do conflicts in more than one theater of operation.
Yeah, absolutely. They can't. I mean, it's proven, and they're not going to go to war with China, because how are they going to fight that war? They're not going to go to war with them, directly. So if they want a proxy war, who's going to fight it on their behalf?
Certainly not Taiwan.
Well, no one's going to fight it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the US can't, and the US has admitted, even if someone had a harebrained idea that the United States would go to war with China, they're years away from being able to do that. And notwithstanding the fact that China's a nuclear power who would go, Okay, is that what's going to happen? Right, let's have a nuclear war then. Again, it's all this idea. Well, we'll all, have duels with pistols until the point one of us goes, "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't want. I'm not obeying the Queensberry rules anymore. I'm going to press the nuclear button." I mean, there's these kind of crazy ideas that this is how war plays out. When you have nuclear powers and they go to war, they're not going to have a ground offensive. They're going to go straight for the nuclear option because, in their mind, they're always going to think, well, the other side might do this. So we better do it first. That's just simple warfare. And therefore, a war with China is not going to happen. So the US can only fight an economic war, and that's failing. So the US's other priorities, which Rubio might be referring to, is the enormous domestic internal problems the US knows it's now facing. And that is going to keep them extremely busy for a very long time.
Absolutely. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of this discussion and for your insight.
Yes, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you, as always, for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.